Picture this, the fighting in Ukraine has been going on for over 4 years now. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers are dead. Cities are in ruins. And after all of that, the single most important decision left on the table isn't really about tanks or missiles anymore. It's about a piece of paper, a guarantee, a promise that says, if this war ever restarts, someone will actually show up. And whether that promise gets written the way Ukraine wants it, the way Russia will tolerate it, or somewhere messy in between, could decide whether this war ends in a real peace or just a pause before the next one. So let's talk about NATO's next move, because I don't think people outside the security world fully grasp how much is riding on it right now. First, let's clear up something that gets mixed up constantly in headlines. Ukraine is not about to join NATO. That door, at least for now, is functionally closed. Russia has made it a central, non-negotiable demand in every round of talks since the invasion began. No NATO membership for Ukraine. Full stop. And the current American administration has, at various points, signaled it's willing to concede exactly that point in exchange for other things. So if you're waiting for the headline, Ukraine joins NATO, you can stop waiting. That's not the next move. The actual next move is stranger, more improvised, and in some ways more interesting than a membership vote. It's what's being called informally an Article 5-like guarantee, something that looks like NATO's core promise that an attack on one member is an attack on all without Ukraine actually becoming a member. Think of it as NATO's protection without NATO's passport. And figuring out exactly what that means in practice, who commits troops, who pays, who actually pulls the trigger if Russia attacks again, is a live unresolved question that will define whatever comes after this war. Here's how we got here. Back in January of this year, more than 24 heads of state and government gathered in Paris for what's being called the Coalition of the Willing Summit. France and the UK pledged to deploy their own forces into Ukraine after any ceasefire, establishing what they're calling military hubs, basically forward operating bases to train and equip Ukrainian forces and store weapons close to where they'd be needed. Zelensky called it real, substantive progress, not just words on paper, but a joint declaration with actual commitments attached. For the first time, American envoys sat in on those talks directly alongside the Europeans, which matters, because up until then, a lot of the security guarantee conversation had been Europe talking to itself while Washington watched from a distance. Then in December, the Trump administration went further than almost anyone expected. A senior U.S. official told reporters after 2 days of talks in Berlin that Washington was offering Ukraine what they explicitly called a NATO-like Article 5 inches guarantee tied to a peace deal, though the official was careful to add that the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever. Trump himself said negotiators had resolved something like 90% of the outstanding issues between Ukraine and Russia, and that he believed he could get Russia to accept both the security guarantee and a path toward European Union membership for Ukraine. That's a big claim. Whether it survives contact with reality is a different question entirely, and we'll get to why. So here's the actual mechanism NATO and its members are building right now, piece by piece. First, there's PRL, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. It's not glamorous, but it's the plumbing that keeps everything else running. Instead of European countries buying weapons from wherever they can find them, PRL lets NATO's top military commander in Europe identify exactly what Ukraine needs, source it from American stockpiles, and have European and Canadian allies foot the bill. As of a few weeks ago, allies had already committed more than $6 billion through this mechanism. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte has been blunt about why this exists. After 4 years of war, Europe's own weapons stockpiles are running low, so the alliance has to lean on what's still sitting in American warehouses, paid for by everyone else. It's an unusual arrangement. American weapons, European money, Ukrainian battlefield. But it's become the backbone of how the West is currently sustaining Ukraine's defense. Second, there's the coalition of the willing ground component, the part where actual foreign troops might end up standing on Ukrainian soil. France has said it could contribute several thousand troops. The UK and France have talked about establishing protected facilities and military hubs inside Ukraine to support its defense long after any ceasefire is signed. This is the part of the plan that makes Moscow the angriest, and for good reason, because it's the part that would most directly limit what a rearmed, remotivated Russia could try again in 5 or 10 years. Third, and this is the piece that's genuinely new, The United States has now said it would be completely involved in guaranteeing Ukraine's security after a deal, not just supplying weapons from the sidelines the way it has for most of the war. Rutte described it as a three-part structure: NATO's own coordination piece, the European coalition of the willing's ground piece, and now an American piece layered on top. If Russia ever thought about attacking again, Rutte argued, the calculation has fundamentally changed compared to the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015. Deals that, by most independent counts, Russia violated dozens, if not hundreds of times over the following years without meaningful consequence. The entire point of building this new structure is to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself a third time. Now, if this all sounds like it's coming together nicely, let me pump the brakes, because there's an enormous amount standing between. We've discussed a framework, and this framework actually deters anyone. Start with Russia's actual position, not what Western officials hope it will eventually be. Vladimir Putin has explicitly and repeatedly ruled out any deployment of NATO country troops on Ukrainian soil under any label. As recently as this year's rounds of shuttle diplomacy, Russian negotiators have expressed deep hesitation about Ukraine receiving any security guarantee that even resembles Article 5. Analysts who've gone through the actual draft language of the American peace proposal point out that what's on paper is a lot vaguer than the NATO-like branding suggests. A reliable but conditional American guarantee that would evaporate if Ukraine ever struck Russian territory, even by accident or without authorization. Compare that to NATO's real Article 5, which doesn't come with an asterisk like that, and you start to see the gap between the marketing and the mechanics. Then there's the territorial question, which remains the single biggest unresolved fault line. The initial American peace framework called for formally recognizing Crimea, Luhansk, and all of Donetsk, including the roughly 1/4 of Donetsk that Ukraine still actually controls and would have to voluntarily withdraw from as Russian territory. Ukraine's counterproposal instead wants the front lines frozen roughly where they currently sit. No forced withdrawal from fortified positions Ukraine still holds. That's not a small gap to close. Zelensky has warned publicly that withdrawing from the parts of Donetsk Ukraine still controls would hand Russia its most heavily fortified defensive terrain without Moscow having to fire another shot to take it, a strategic gift disguised as a peace concession. And even the ceasefire piece, the most basic building block that everything else depends on, keeps collapsing. Back in April, Putin declared a 32-hour Easter ceasefire, and Zelensky agreed to observe it reciprocally. Within hours, both sides were accusing each other of violations. By the next morning, Ukraine's military had logged over 2,000 alleged violations by Russia, and Russia's defense ministry claimed nearly 2,000 by Ukraine. In May, the two sides couldn't even agree on the dates of a temporary truce, declaring competing unilateral ceasefires days apart from each other, each accusing the other of bad faith. If the two sides can't hold a cordial pause around a religious holiday or a parade, you should be deeply skeptical about how durable any broader security architecture will be once the cameras and diplomats go home. So why does any of this matter to you, sitting wherever you're watching this from, thousands of miles from the front lines? Let me give you 3 reasons, because I think this is one of those stories that looks distant right up until it isn't. Reason 1, this is the live test case for what deterrence looks like in the 21st century. For nearly 80 years, the entire Western security order has rested on one simple, brutal logic. If you attack a NATO member, you're not just fighting that one country, you're fighting the United States, the UK, France, and 30 other nations simultaneously, and that's supposed to be unthinkable enough to prevent the attack from ever happening in the first place. What's being tested right now in Ukraine is whether you can build something that functions like that guarantee, gets most of the deterrent effect without the formal membership that triggers it automatically. If it works, it becomes a template, a way to extend real protection to vulnerable countries without expanding NATO's formal membership roles, which could apply to plenty of other flashpoints around the world later. If it fails, if Russia calls the bluff and nothing meaningful happens, it sends the opposite signal to every authoritarian government watching closely that these hybrid guarantees are theater, and the only security that actually means something is full membership, guns and boots, or nothing at all. Reason 2, this is a genuine test of whether the United States under this administration is still willing to be the backbone of European security, or whether it's slowly, quietly stepping back and leaving Europe to cover the gap. You've probably seen reporting on this shift already. Reduced American troop commitments floated in various proposals, blunt talk from Washington about Europe needing to spend and do more of the heavy lifting itself. An administration that campaigned in part on skepticism toward exactly this kind of open-ended overseas commitment. At the same time, you have this administration now explicitly offering an unprecedented Article 5 style guarantee to a non-member country. Those two impulses are in direct tension with each other, and how that tension resolves will tell you a lot about American foreign policy for the next decade, not just about Ukraine. Reason 3, and this is the one I think about the most, Europe's own defense industrial base is being tested in real time, and the results are not reassuring. Independent assessments of NATO's eastern flank countries, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, the frontline nations that would bear the brunt of any renewed Russian aggression, found that while political will and defense spending have both genuinely increased since 2022, actual battle readiness remains uneven, and in some cases fragile. Higher budgets don't automatically translate into faster mobilization, deeper ammunition stockpiles, or better logistics. That gap between spending and actually being ready matters enormously, because a security guarantee is only as credible as the forces standing behind it. A promise backed by hollowed-out stockpiles and slow mobilization timelines isn't much of a deterrent. It's a bluff, and bluffs get called eventually. But let's talk honestly about what happens under a few different versions of NATO's next move, because I think laying out the branches makes this much clearer than treating it as one single outcome. If the coalition of the willing framework actually gets finalized with real troop commitments, real funding, and Russia grudgingly tolerates it because it's exhausted and needs sanctions relief more than it needs to keep fighting, you get something like a durable if uneasy peace. Ukraine keeps most of its sovereignty and a real defensive backbone. Russia keeps some territorial gains it's already seized on the ground, dressed up as a face-saving settlement. It's not a happy ending for Ukraine, but it's a survivable one, and it sets a template other vulnerable states might eventually seek to copy. If the framework gets finalized on paper, but the actual troop numbers, funding commitments, and mobilization capacity are as thin as some of the Eastern Flank readiness assessments suggest, you get a guarantee that looks solid in a press release and turns out to be hollow in a crisis. That's arguably the most dangerous outcome of all, because it could actually encourage a future Russian move rather than deter one. Nothing invites aggression quite like a security promise that everyone, including the aggressor, quietly knows won't actually be honored when it's tested. And if negotiations collapse entirely, if Russia continues to reject any Western troop presence, and Ukraine continues to reject the territorial concessions being asked of it, then NATO's next move isn't really about a guarantee at all. It's about how long the current level of support, through mechanisms like PRL, can be sustained while the war grinds on with no resolution in sight. Some of the more sobering assessments out there describe this as something close to a stalemate in the game theory sense, a situation where neither side at this moment actually has the capacity to force the outcome it wants, which makes continued fighting more likely than a clean resolution in either direction, at least in the near term. I want to end with a historical echo here because I think it's a part that gets lost the most. NATO was built in 1949 for exactly one purpose: to make sure that if the Soviet Union ever attacked Western Europe, it would be attacking everyone at once, and that this would be so obviously catastrophic that no rational leader would ever try it. That single idea held for 75 years without a single member being invaded. What's happening right now in Ukraine is, in a real sense, the first serious attempt to extend a version of that same idea to a country the alliance was never willing to fully bring inside its own walls. Whether that experiment succeeds tells you something enormous about whether deterrence can be exported half measure by half measure to the places that need it most without provoking the very war it's meant to prevent, or whether real security only ever comes from being all the way in with nothing held back. So here's what I'd leave you with. Watch what actually gets signed, not what gets announced. Announcements are cheap, coalitions of the willing, Article 5-like language, 90% of the issues resolved, actual funding that survives the next election cycle in whichever country is paying for it, actual willingness to honor the guarantee the day it's tested rather than the day it's signed. That's the real next move, and it hasn't happened yet. What do you think NATO and its allies should actually do here? Commit fully to boots on the ground and a real Article 5 style promise even at the risk of provoking exactly the war it's trying to prevent, or hold back and accept that Ukraine's security will always be a half measure. Tell me where you land, and if you want more breakdowns like this as this story keeps developing, you know exactly what to do.